Good morning, friends. I'm asking you to please have a seat. It's great to see everyone. Listening to your conversations, your laughter, it's great. Our friends online, welcome to you today. A few announcements. Don't forget, we have the silent auction going on, and you have until 5:30 this evening to place your bids. At the end of the silent auction is a timeline that was prepared for us by Joy Britt Revis of the history of Quakers, the past 350 years in North Carolina, including the future. And we have several special guests with us from Baltimore. They are former Kenyans who are now living in Baltimore, African friends in North America, and we'll hear more from them later today. Our first item on the agenda is a report from Don Farlow about NCYM Inc., and he's the chair of that committee. He's the chairman of the board, and he's going to share some information.
So I'll begin by saying I'm the clerk of the board, not the chair of the board. We're still a Quaker organization. I'm being a wise guy. So, thank you. 5 years ago, North Carolina Yearly Meeting approved of a reorganization that established the two yearly meetings that now comprise the former North Carolina Yearly Meeting. One of the other entities that was established at that time was NCYM Inc. to address a series of business circumstances that the yearly meeting needed to address over time. In that category were things like Moa Choctaw and what will we do with it, Friends Disaster Service and establishing it as an LLC, the sale of the property at Spring Garden, the sale of the property at Hilltop, the investment of those funds, just an array of business circumstances. There is also the ongoing oversight of various agreements that were established with Quaker Lake Camp, with the trustees of trust funds. And so all those are ongoing activities that will continue into the future. There is one area that we wanted to touch on with you because it will be a challenge, whether it's NCYM Inc., the two yearly meetings. We have the challenge of our cemeteries that are owned by North Carolina Yearly Meeting that, in effect, most of you probably can't name all of them. I certainly couldn't when I started this process. I didn't know where, I knew where maybe one or two were, but I will tell you, Google Maps will not take you to all of them. So I'll begin from there and just appreciate this opportunity to share with you the concern that we bring today. First slide would be the purpose, and that is, as it was established while it was still North Carolina Yearly Meeting, to provide care for Friends cemeteries which are no longer connected to an active Friends meeting in North Carolina Yearly Meeting. At the time, the parenthetical FUM was there. That was how we identified ourselves. And today, that would be NCYM Inc. and the two yearly meetings that now exist. Next slide. The cemeteries range from northeastern North Carolina to south of we'll say, Bush River in South Carolina. In northeastern North Carolina, in Perquimans and Pasquotank counties, you would find Little River, Simons Creek, and Narrows. Average distance from Quaker Lake Camp to those locations is 230 miles. It's not next door if you need to make arrangements for things to be accomplished. In Davie County, we have Dutchman's Creek. That's only 50 miles away. There may be some in the room that have weed eat and chopped brush and whatever there. It's not that far. You can go early in the morning and put in a day and keep it in relatively good shape. Newberry, South Carolina, next slide. 190 miles away. That Bush River location is just before you arrive at Bush River. and we'll take a look at that property in just a moment. And then in Wayne County, North Carolina, there are 4 cemeteries: Hollowell Massey, Woodland, Bethany, and Pearson Edgerton. In a moment, I'll kind of show you some slides from each of those cemeteries, but there are now 8 cemeteries for which we are responsible. The cemetery that was referred to often as the Old Quaker Cemetery near Galax, Virginia, we were able to negotiate an arrangement with the people that were holding services in the building that was there, that they would maintain that cemetery. That property had been uninsured for probably 35 or 40 years, as it turns out, as we began to dig into this. And so we simply said, we'll deed you the property if you will accept the perpetual care. So that is one that we've been able to deal with in a manner that hopefully will care for it in perpetuity. Next slide. The cemetery care funds, we have over $200,000 in a trust fund that does support the care of these cemeteries. There's another $15,000 that is held by the clerk of court in Pasquotank County for the care exclusively of Simons Creek Cemetery. In 2021, the 4% payout from the trust funds was $6,800. You'll note that the expenses that year were just under $5,900. It is the case that 4 of the cemeteries are cared for by volunteers or family or neighbors. So this is this 5,860 is just for approximately 1/2 of the cemeteries. And then in 2021, we paid out almost $7,000. Excuse me, the balance was almost $7,000, and the payout was a little over $7,000. So right now, we're able to fund what it cost us on an annual basis without an issue. The main issue is coordinating the care. Looking forward, that picture has the potential to change significantly. So next slide, thank you. There'll come a time when the funds are more than likely inadequate. The family and volunteers that have been caring for these cemeteries will diminish. At Narrows, at Dutchman's Creek, at Bush River, and at Bethany, family members and volunteers address all of the work. Our cemetery caregivers are like me and a few others in the room that are, we'll say, reaching a certain stage in life. And so many of them will become increasingly unable to manage that work. Very bluntly, they have done that work for almost no payment. It's been to our advantage to have them care for these cemeteries at Little River, at Simons Creek, Hollowell Massey, at Woodland, and at Pearson Edgerton. There is no cemetery name signage at several of these cemeteries. It's not necessary that we do that. It's something that in the past the cemetery committee sought to do. It's something we may want to consider, but again, several of them do not have signage that would indicate Dutchman's Creek or even Simons Creek. There are markers there, but there's no name on it. Other challenges, if we go to the next slide, there will be greater care required at some point for several of these cemeteries, Dutchman's Creek and Pearson Edgerton particularly. It is people who pretty much just show up, I won't say haphazardly, but it is not maintained in an ongoing basis. So at some point, if we wish to provide the same level of care as we have at the other cemeteries, there will be an increased cost there. Very bluntly, finding local resources to address cemeteries 200 plus miles away or 190 miles away or even 50 miles away is a challenge. And as we go forward, it will become more and more likely that we have to use a commercial lawn mowing service. And most of you have some acquaintanceship with that, and you understand the cost will increase significantly. And so that's what we somewhat have in our future. So how do we address this long-term, this perpetual care that we've agreed to with our acceptance of many of these cemeteries with accompanying funds. Now, I'll just observe that the accompanying funds were not at a level that would sustain these properties, the care of these properties in perpetuity. $5,000 won't do it in perpetuity. Someone might have put it all in Apple or something like that, but on a given day, even that won't be sufficient. So we have this challenge before us. Next slide. So we'll begin up in northeastern North Carolina. We have 2 meetings that are still active in that area, but they do not belong to either FCNC or NCFF. Those 2 meetings are Piney Woods and Upriver. So they are not in a position necessarily to attend to these cemeteries. It might be something that we would want to pursue with them, but at this point, that has not been done. The first cemetery that you see with a highlighted block is Little River, and Little River should be special to all of us in the Piedmont. In 1751, a Quaker minister named Abigail Pike and another lady and a few others, I'm sure, traveled to Little River from Cane Creek. That was a distance of 215 miles if you were traveling on today's highways. Now, again, that's 270 years ago. So think about the process of traveling from this area to the Outer Banks almost in this period 270 years ago. So we owe much to those 2 ladies and the others that travel with them to get permission from the quarterly meeting to establish Cane Creek monthly meeting in this region. And those that know their history, and Cheryl can speak to it, Cane Creek often referred to as the mother of meetings. And most of us are descended from that meeting as either children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So again, a special cemetery. Richard Wilcox will speak about this area this afternoon as he does his program about the visit of William Edmondson and George Fox as they came to this region of North Carolina here around Little River and up all the way to Somerton, where Richard serves as pastor. They were in that area in 1672, so he will share with us about that. The closest meeting to this region of North Carolina that is active in either FCNC or NCFF is Somerton, and they're some 50 miles away. The next of these meetings, next slide, is Simons Creek, again in Pasquotank County. And I'm going to turn around and point. I don't have my pointer up here. If you look in the upper right-hand corner and look at that body of land, that is the beginning of the Outer Banks, just in case you're wondering where this is in North Carolina, to put in perspective the distance from where we are to where they are. And Etta Florence can tell you how long it takes to drive even on autopilot. I mean, her car just knows how to do that after all these years. Next slide would show the third cemetery in this area up at Narrows. And this is really the only cemetery that's in somewhat a city. And we'll talk again a little more about that in a moment. But all 3 of these cemeteries are roughly 230, 40 miles away from us here at Quaker Lake today. Next slide. So if you looked at this without the little block I have drawn in yellow, you wouldn't know there was a cemetery there. If you were to drive by it and there wasn't a sign, you wouldn't know there's a cemetery there. Next slide, please. This is the signage that was placed there by North Carolina Yearly Meetings several years ago. The meeting began in 1715. The property was conveyed to the meeting in 1744. But then the meeting house was sold in 1856. And remember, this is in the run-up to the Civil War. People have begun to migrate. They began a couple of decades earlier. and they have essentially all left, or the remaining few are now moving to other meetings in the area. Next slide. If you look at the picture on the left, that's the cemetery. In the foreground, you see what looks like a couple of rocks. If you look on the right-hand corner, there's one rock in the entire cemetery that has any markings on it that you can read today. And it looks like an MM with 1811. Remember, Quakers often didn't mark their graves at all. The standard was, if you marked it, simplicity. We've forgotten a little bit maybe, but simplicity. It was a rock, or maybe a rock with something scratched into it versus how we might see our cemeteries today. But again, this region, so important to this part of North Carolina and the spread of Quakerism in North Carolina. Next slide. At Simon's Creek, Ed Florence's husband had a great deal to do with having this site cleared. Frankly, it was in bordered a large fields, and a lot of agricultural debris had been dumped on portions of this site. And so Clifford had much to do with seeing that that was removed, and at least it's a good, clean site today. Again, you'll notice that on some of the addresses, I'll say adjacent to or next to. None of these have an address. They're just a location that you've got to use a reference to a street corner or to an adjacent property to locate them. Next slide. The marker on the left here is actually for the first school in North Carolina. It was at this site, in addition to this being what was initially stated as the first Quaker meeting house in North Carolina. Frankly, there is a little dispute about that. Little River may have been earlier. It was all a matter of months. If it's the case, we'll let the locals there debate the history, but some dispute. But neither of the markers, and you can go to the next slide, neither of the markers that you see, either the one for the school or the one for the meeting house, say Simon's Creek. You cannot visit this site and determine that this is Simon's Creek unless you're a local person that knows that this little stream that comes up off the Little River that has now become almost a dry creek bed by the time it gets there, except when it's draining from the fields, is Simon's Creek. Next slide. Narrows. So this is a city lot. It is adjacent to Hollywood Cemetery. You would not have a clue that it's ever been a cemetery. There is not a single marker, rock, indication. The neighbor accepted mowing the property several years ago after people from Upriver Meeting had cleared it, and has maintained it quite well through the years. And I've visited all these except Bush River several times. I've only been to Bush River once. And again, in this area, the local caretakers have done good work. Here at Narrows, you can see pictures. Next slide. And again, we're just at the corner of two city streets, Pear Tree Road and Boston Avenue. And there's nothing that would indicate this was ever a cemetery. Next slide. At Dutchman's Creek, if we let it go, it'll be a series of stones in the woods, much like you are a meeting cemetery. David Briles can tell us about that. It's been cleaned a time or two, but it's a thicket with a few grave markers in it. I think the name Narrows, I haven't been able to document this, but if you look at the map, you'll see that the river narrows considerably immediately above Elizabeth City, where this cemetery is located. And I suspect way back in the day, before it became Elizabeth City, it was known as Narrows just because of that constriction of the river. No markers at all. Next slide, please. So the first time we visited Dutchman's Creek, there's a farm road that goes it along the edge of the woods now that goes to the chicken houses you see up in the upper right-hand corner. The chicken houses weren't there. The road wasn't there. There's sort of a cul-de-sac at the dead-end street. So I wandered over however much land for quite a while before I ever stumbled across the cemetery. If you'll go to that slide, back up one, please. Back up one more. As you can see, this photo was made when the site was relatively clear, except of the leaves. Saplings grow up in a single season. They can basically disguise the stones in pretty short order unless you're on top of it. Now there is great access because of the agricultural road that's been put into the chicken houses. It's a good wide road. You can actually park on the shoulder and do whatever maintenance you wish to do. But all these slides, I want to be able to offer them to any meeting that has an interest. I can send the file. I sent it to Mariana for the minutes last night or the night before. And so it can go through the email. So if you have interest as a meeting, as a yearly meeting, I'll provide this file, and there is sufficient information to find any of these cemeteries with what's on the slides here. Let's go to Bush River. So anybody here know Bush Hill? So Bush Hill became Archdale. My presumption is that Bush Hill got its name from Bush River because as Bush River was laid down in 1822, many of those members of Bush River meeting migrated to what became known as Bush Hill. Can't document that that's the fact, but certainly the perception that that's the fact. So again, persons at first at Springfield Friends meeting, and then later at Archdale meeting, you'd find last names, family names that are similar. Again, laid down in 1822. This next slide, you can see Dennis Dairy Road. You can see the river comes down, and the one remnant besides the highway historical marker that tells you Quakers might have once been there is there's a road running across the lower left-hand corner called Quaker Road. And just happened to stumble across that and thought, okay, there is some residue of us there. What's really neat about this cemetery is there is a Facebook group of descendants of people who are interred there. And they raise funds annually, usually by contributions among themselves, to maintain this cemetery. Still belongs to North Carolina Yearly Meeting, but they do the maintenance. It's got large trees in it, and so it basically has a covering of leaves that prevent a lot of the undergrowth. Next slide, please. So in eastern North Carolina, Wayne County, you see 4 cemeteries that we own. 2 of those were family cemeteries. 2 of those were meeting cemeteries. So let's talk about first Woodland Friends, and we can go to that slide. It's the case that the Hollowell, let's stay right there. We want to be right there. Misspoke. The Hollowell Massey family, and Frank Massey in particular, leads that family in providing funds, also some labor. You can see that it's got a new fence with new gates around the entire cemetery. They are the only entity that has continued to provide family care to the level that you see at Hollowell Massey. And again, just next slide very briefly, will show the location. And when they built the new 117, they were in the midst of that when we first visited there. And So your GPS and your road maps, nothing worked. You had to go stumble around and find out, how do I get there, since they cut access to the road off from 117. So hopefully the directions here with street names and so on now would help, as you might be interested in that. Then Woodland Friends, that became a part of the property of North Carolina Yearly Meeting as a part of the resolution of the laying down of Woodland Friends Meeting. And we assumed the ownership and the care of that cemetery. There is a local funeral home that periodically will inter someone there with our permission. And typically that is because the family doesn't have the means to have them interred in, we'll say, a memorial park or something of that nature. So there are occasional burials there still today. And next slide would show you, again, the difficulty in gaining access to Woodland. It is in a neighborhood. There is no street address. You use the adjacent property address, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide is Bethany Friends Meeting. It was a cemetery. It was formerly Falling Creek. Again, this is a situation where the meeting was laid down. The property in that case reverted to the family because those were the stipulations in the original deed. And in turn, the family deeded the property to the yearly meeting with some funding. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the outline of the property. It's some 4 acres, but essentially the cemetery is quite a bit smaller than that. And I would say probably only a third to a half of the cemetery is being used. And then lastly, Pearson Edgerton. Again, one that's difficult to find because it's probably 500 feet off the road. It's adjacent to, whenever we've been there, a soybean field next to a patch of woods. So good luck finding that. But actually, there is a street address for the little house that's out in front of this cemetery. And so it can be located in that manner. So how do we address the long-term care of these cemeteries? Are there meetings within NCFF, FCNC that are willing to take over the care? Are either FCNC or NCFF willing to take over the care? Would it be okay if NCYM Inc. deeded any one of these cemeteries to a group that was willing to assume ownership and perpetual care of these cemeteries? In much the same manner that we see Bush River behaving. Would it be acceptable to deed any one of these cemeteries to a funeral home with a stipulation that the cemetery be used for those that can't afford other accommodations, if you will, and that the funeral home would provide perpetual care? Is it acceptable? I think you probably need to take, I know you're on the right one. Is it acceptable to let nature take its course? Particularly when you think about Dutchman's Creek, where it's in a patch of woods. If the care of these cemeteries continues to be the responsibility of NCYM Inc., then we're likely going to have to designate a portion of our undesignated trust fund income in future years to pay for care. That may be 10 years, that may be 20 years, that may be 50 years. But the day is coming, if we wish to have this done ultimately by commercial lawn services, etc. So we want to bring this as a concern and gather your input about how you wish to see this perpetuated in the future. NCYM Inc. is willing to make decisions, but in this case, because of family and meeting, etc., we felt like this needed input beyond just a quote unquote business input. We would like to have your feedback by June 30th of next year. Again, if any meeting or either one of the two yearly meetings wishes to have the file for their review, it's available. More than happy to send it to you. But we would love to have your input about any direction you would offer for the future care or your own volunteering as a meeting or as a yearly meeting to provide care. And probably don't have time now, but just any immediate questions, clerk, if that's okay. Any immediate questions or comments, and again, just looking at it in the broadest sense possible. Yes. As far as churches go, we are private cemeteries. As far as churches go, we are exempted from all laws except the depth at which we bury bodies. Forgive me for putting it that way. But essentially, we can go and walk away. Not suggesting that, just telling you, because have explored it, frankly, with a law professor at Wake Forest, who has been most helpful. Thanks to one of the members of our NCYM Inc. board, they were aware of this person specializing in cemetery law, and essentially North Carolina has no criteria relative to churches and cemeteries. Please reach out to me or to Brenda or to whomever if you want a copy of the file. I do want to transition to a couple of other brief topics. So following the 5-year term of the initial board of NCYM Inc., we're to establish a rotation, essentially a 3-year rotation like you're all accustomed to from the many activities of our yearly meetings, past and present, to continue the work of the NCYM Inc. board. So one member of the board from FCNC is unable to continue as we establish this rotation. What this means is some people will serve 1 more year, some people will serve 2 years, some people will serve 3 years, and over that period of time, we'll continue to roll in 2 from FCNC and 2 from NCFF, and somewhere out there will be a self-perpetuating board, not self-perpetuating, we'll be perpetuating a board with 2 representatives replaced each year. With that one person unable to continue, I did want to take a moment and just recognize the service of that person. And I'll call the name first. It's Mariana McCall. These past 5 years, she has traveled thousands of miles coming to meetings from Goldsboro to Greensboro and or High Point, as the case may be, to do the work of NCYM Inc. Her level of engagement, her involvement on behalf of FCNC has been outstanding. And I just want to thank her before you, and I hope you will extend your thanks to her for the work that she's done on your behalf and on behalf of Quakers in North Carolina. Thank you, Mariana. If you look at the column on the left, those are the representatives from NCFF. Column on the right is from FCNC. No, there is not a political implication there, but you know. You'll see 2 asterisks. Terry Harris replaced Ken Hill, who relocated to Virginia, and Kay Coltrane replaced Gwen Taylor, who is deceased. And those are the only 2 changes in the board over the 5-year period, and you approved the change to Kay with the departure of Gwen Taylor. Next slide. These are the current officers of the board. It just so happens that this board wasn't designed this way. We just let it happen. at the initial board, and it's continued with the two replacements. The board, excuse me, the officers themselves happen to be half FCNC and half NCFF. We didn't set out to do that. Our purpose was to get right people in right place, and this is how it occurred. So with this rotation and the need to replace one person, I'm going to ask Paul to, in just a moment, put up the slide for this rotation and the years of service and the recommended replacement for Mariana. The person that the board wishes to recommend to this group to replace Mariana would be Julie Hatchell from Center Meeting. And Judy Ritter is going to share a little bit about Julie's background.
Thank you, Don. As Don says, Julie Hatchell is from Center Friends, and she indicated to us that, in fact, she is a lifelong member of Center. A factor that the current trustees, those there that you saw listed, a factor we saw in Julie that was especially would make her a valuable trustee was that she became involved with the committee that diligently worked over many months, meeting in Greensboro to develop the plan of reorganization for North Carolina Yearly Meeting, and therefore is familiar with the work that needs to be done by the trustees of NCYM Inc. So she brings that early history as she is being recommended for this position. And she would serve a 3-year term, eligible for a second 3-year term. Um, a little bit about Julie and where her involvement at Center. She currently serves as the clerk administrating council, and she's served on many committees there, taught Sunday school, and is part of the choir. She also served as a trustee of North Carolina Yearly Meeting. Julie is an attorney and has been in practice, as I counted her experience, around 25 years. She focuses in the areas of real estate planning, and bankruptcy. She graduated from Campbell University with a BA and from Campbell University School of Law with a JD degree. Julie enjoys lots of outside activities, as well as reading, and loves spending time with her huge family. I'm impressed with her. Hope you are too. I think she'll make a great trustee.
Any questions or comments from Judy or Don? You've heard the recommendation from the NCYM Inc. board. Would you approve of Julie Hatchell being named as the new trustee for the board? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And with that said, scroll to the next slide. And this will just reflect the rotation that's been established. You see Julie's name in the lower right-hand corner, 3-year term. But this would show you when we expect people to roll off the board, and it implies the replacements you will need to provide in the time frame 2 per year. So this afternoon, I'm going to take a moment just to share one slide. This afternoon at 4 o'clock, I'm doing a presentation about Seth W. Laughlin, CO in the CSA. Everybody in the room knows what a CO is, right? A conscientious objector. And you know what the CSA is? Confederate States of America or Confederate States Army. So from the memorial to Seth W. Laughlin, from the minutes of North Carolina yearly meeting in 1865, and then suspended by the thumbs for an hour and a half each day for about a week. And finally, when they, parenthetical portion is mine, his thumbs were separated, and I'll stop there. So please come back and join us to find out what happened to Seth W. Laughlin. Part of your history. Part of your history. And don't forget, Richard's going to do a program at 3 about Fox and Edmondson and Quakers in northeastern North Carolina. And last slide, I'll just remind you that the NCYM Inc. annual meeting for this year is November 5th, right here at Quaker Lake. Would encourage you to come to that. Frankly, attendance has not been good. Yes, it has been primarily a business meeting. This year, we'll be sending out an agenda that will show a little bit of time for fellowship and fun and food and likely business in the afternoon rather than in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, for those commercials. And thank you for presenting this concern, which is a very weighty matter. I believe our Administrative Oversight Committee will need to discuss this in some detail about what to do about our cemeteries. So everyone should know who your quarter representative is on the AOC. So if you have concerns or suggestions you would like to make, please let myself or your quarter representative know how you feel about how we handle this concern. At this time, we're going to call on Colin Saxton from Friends United Meeting. He is the coordinator for American, well, let's see, he's got so many titles, it's hard to keep up with all of them. A North American Ministries Director, how's that? And Advancement Director, and blah, so forth and so on. But he's basically a wonderful representative for Quakers around the world.
Good morning, friends. It's lovely to be with you. Last night, our friend Bob Carter talked about the body of Christ, and he asked the question, what's your place in the body of Christ? Now, when your name's Colin, that's not a question you like to think about very much, but it's a really important question. It's one I do think a lot about is what is our place? What is my place? What's God asking of me to be a part of this fellowship that Bob talked about, of this group that is the presence of Christ in the world, that has the responsibility to proclaim and demonstrate the good news of Jesus Christ to a hurting world. Paul, would you throw the PowerPoint up there really quickly? So part of the work I do is working with congregations, both in my role with FUM and also with my role with Everence. And this slide shows some of the changing dynamics that are going on in our culture, the decline that many of us feel in our churches. Now, the question I want to ask at a time when it feels like the church is diminishing is, why do you stay involved? Why bother staying involved in your church? Do you do it out of duty, out of habit, or because this actually really matters? That this great experiment that God has created of being the body of Christ actually matters. That we have this wonderful opportunity that Bob identified again last night in a hopeless world. Don't we have a message of hope? In a time where people feel this great anxiety, aren't we the people who are able to talk about a peace that passes all understanding? At a time where people say that they're spiritual, that they really want an authentic relationship with a God who can transform their lives, don't we have something to offer them? At a time when young people are saying over and over again they want to be involved in somehow changing the world and in being involved in something that's making a real difference in the world, isn't that something that we can offer? So I don't see this as so much as bad news, but it highlights that sense of opportunity again that Bob was talking about. And I think he's going to talk about today, too, as we think about reaching out to the world around us. The next slide relates to at this time of crisis that many of us feel, it's also caused us to do a bit of thinking. Now, I think these numbers are actually inflated. I don't believe that in 2005, 74% of people were really open to change. I think that was us on wishful thinking. But you could see that over time that there was a sense of, no, we don't really want to change. But then we hit about 2015, and we've watched the church diminish. We've watched our finances go down, our numbers go down. We've watched in the place of Quakers, we've watched our yearly meetings divide and disintegrate. And all of a sudden, there's a group of people who are saying, no, we really probably need to change things. And so then you hit the pandemic, and suddenly people are going, oh boy, what do we need to do? What's God calling us to do in this world? If you go to the next slide. One of the really important questions that I like to ask is again, the why question. We can talk about sometimes as members of the church, we can talk about what we do. Well, we meet on Sunday mornings, as if that's the point, right? That's not what the church is. The church isn't an event. Church isn't a program. We're people on a journey together with Christ to make a difference in the world. We can talk sometimes about how we do it, how we go about it. But the really important question is why? Why do we do it? Well, because the Spirit of God is alive in us and transforming us and calling us to be that incarnational presence that Bob talked so beautifully about last night. We are to be and continue the work of Christ in the world. The next slide. Actually, you can go on to the next one. We'll just pass on that. So one of the things that I like to think about is how do we continue to do this work? How do we be that presence? And I like to think about our work not as being an event, but or even a church building. But to think about our life together as a congregation, as a parish, you're part of a larger community. It's not just the people who show up on Sunday morning. It's not just the people who are somehow attached to our some program we do in the building, but you are part of this larger community where you get to be this incarnational presence. And so how do we reach out to that community in a wide variety of ways? I'm eager to hear, Bob, some of your ideas today about how we do that really important work. And how do we share that message in a way that gets a hearing? Don talked about Quaker Alphabet Soup today, and he used a lot of acronyms, and we do that in the core group. We know what it means when we talk about a CO or FCNC or NCFF, but how do you talk to people who are out a little bit further? How do you share the gospel in a way that gets a hearing? These are really important questions that we need to be thinking about. Well, back in the day when I was General Secretary of FUM, one of the things that I often heard as I traveled around the US with people is, we love what FUM does in Kenya and in Ramallah and the connections that we have with friends here and the work in Jamaica or other places. But over and over again, what I heard is, what can FUM do for us? Because our church is dying. We can't find a pastor. We're struggling with conflict. There isn't anybody who's helping to train leadership here on a local level so that we can be effective. So the message was, what about North America? So back in 2012 or so, we really started to rethink this question of what is the priority? How is North America the mission field for FUM in which we can be engaged in some new ways? And so we began developing some programming around that. One of the things that we've done in the last year that I know many of you are familiar with is the Billy Britt Fund, as a way of thinking about sustainable and viable ministries that we can support to help yearly meetings and associations do their work more effectively and have the funding that we need to do effective programming. So I'm going to show a brief video that Joy Revis put together on behalf of her father. And yesterday morning, I was at a meeting with Brenda at Joy's home, and she mentioned the lovely minute of appreciation that Michael put together and was going to present today. And both Viola and Joy were moved to tears by that. They were so delighted, so thankful for all of you for your ongoing care and love for their family and your appreciation for Billy. And
This is a video she did. Hello, I am Joy Brett Revis, the daughter of Billy and Viola Britt. I would like to spend the next few minutes sharing some information about the Billy Britt North American Ministries Fund and why your contribution is so important. When my father was North Carolina Yearly Meeting Superintendent from 1974 to 1994, there were over 80 Quaker meetings in North Carolina and Southern Virginia alone, not to mention all the other meetings spread across North America. Total giving from Quaker meetings in North Carolina exceeded $1 million annually for nearly 14,000 members. It was a time of growth and spiritual development like we have not seen in recent years. Times have certainly changed. Declines in membership have created a financial challenge, and the needs are great. There's not been enough financial support to address those needs. Until now. Thanks to Colin Saxton, Director of North American Ministries for Friends United Meeting, an organization my father supported wholeheartedly, the Billy Britt North American Ministries Fund has been created to help provide the resources for programs that can continue to strengthen leaders and local congregations throughout North America. Here are some of the current and emerging North American ministry projects that are supported by the Britt Fund. Unleashing the Power, a series of webinars have been created to provide training to local meetings in areas such as clerking, conflict resolution, treasury training, and more. By engaging with friends across the country, instructors will guide discussions on topics that feel most urgent. Intentional Interim Ministry Network. Pastoral transitions can be one of the most challenging times for a congregation. A team of experienced pastors trained in intentional interim ministry is working with FUM to design and launch this program. The goal is to provide meetings in transition with interim pastors who are able to help the meeting be ready for a long-term pastor who fits their community. Stoking the Fire, an annual spiritual weekend retreat for friends desiring a deeper connection with the living Christ and other friends seeking the same. Flourishing Friends creates a laboratory to help congregations who find themselves stuck or struggling. Within a cohort of other Friends meetings and with experienced facilitators, the Flourishing Friends program helps congregations identify and address barriers to vitality and new paths to faithfulness. FUM's North American Ministry Program is also nurturing immigrant congregations spread throughout the U.S. and Canada, offers workshops and training in cultivating generous congregations, and seeks to build unity within diverse fellowship of friends. FUM's short-term goal is to raise $150,000 by the end of 2023, and to date, over $30,000 has been raised. Longer term, FUM would love to endow the Britt Fund through bequest gifts that will allow this vital work to continue for many years to come. As Billy's father, and as a friend who is deeply concerned about the vitality of our Quaker witness in North America, I am asking that you prayerfully consider contributing to the Billy Britt Fund to support FUM's North American ministries, if you have not already done so. As a token of our gratitude for your donation, our gift to you will be a copy of his memoirs that my dad and I co-wrote, My Quaker Life. To those who have already contributed to the Bread Fund, we offer our sincerest thanks for helping sustain ministries that were important to my father. Your gift matters. You can learn more about my father and the Billy Brett North American Ministries Fund here. Thanks for listening. We're really grateful for you, Yuri, for the many ways you invest in.
And are partnering with FUM in our work around the world. And I'm really grateful because I know several of you have already given to the Billy Britt Fund, and I think your offering this weekend is going to that as well. There's some information in your packet about it. We're now up to about $40,000 from in this fund, and again, that $150,000 is sort of a short-term goal to help us launch some of these programs sustainably over time. Just to highlight a couple of the things that Joy mentioned, this one of the pieces of our work has been to the formation of a North American African Friends in North American Ministries Committee. Did you know that there's a growing number of African immigrant congregations around the U.S. and Canada? You have representatives from one of my favorite ones here. Don't tell them I said that. But the group in Baltimore has provided some really great leadership there. This is really important to us for its friends because did you know that by 2050, here in the US, half of our population is going to be people of color by 2050? That's the reality. And most Quaker groups do not reflect that reality at all. So as you think about your communities, how are you reaching out to the growing, changing face and demographic that you have? And I'm really grateful for your willingness to invite these lovely friends from Baltimore who bring a sense of vitality and a love for Jesus that I think is infectious and are going to be helpful for you. In September, we're relaunching our Unleashing the Power series, which is going to be, instead of in person, it's going to be a online webinar that's available for anybody who wants to join. There's information that FUM's going to be putting out. If you don't get our information, there's some sheets on the FUM table about how you can get our connection and other email communication so that you can know what's going on, how you can be involved in these trainings that are available for you that will connect you with other Quakers around the world, or at least around the U.S. The other one that I'll mention I'll mention just really quickly is a partnership that we have with Everence, which is the other organization I work for, which is around cultivating generous congregations. And this is a workshop that we come and do, and it provides some best practices for congregations as you think about growing your sense of generosity, not just financial generosity, but primarily. What are some ways that congregations that are flourishing financially in terms of being good stewards of the resources that God has called them to do so that they have the funds that are needed to live out the mission that God has called them to do? What are some of those best practices? We'd love to come and provide something like that here in North Carolina if you're interested. And the last one is the Flourishing Friends program. And that's really looking at what are some of the barriers and struggles and challenges that congregations are facing right now? Because they're very real, right? We could wish that we could go back to the time when the heyday of North Carolina yearly meeting, when you had 80 meetings and all that sort of stuff. Friends, that's not going to happen by accident. And it's not going to look that way again. We're in a time of change, and we need to really think prayerfully and deeply and intentionally about what does it mean to be the church in our culture. And we have a cohort of 4 congregations we're launching this fall as a pilot group to do some experimenting around that, and I'm hoping that Flourishing Friends is going to be something that we offer on a broader basis moving forward. So thank you again for all your love and support. Thank you in advance for the contributions that you might make to the Brit Fund, and we look forward to partnering with you to carrying out these programs here.
Thank you, Colin, and I hope you and pray you see from the video and from Colin's explanation how important this North American Ministries Fund is. And we are happy to have our own immigrant congregation with us today in our Kenyan friends who live in Baltimore now. Gilbert is the pastor. Wave your hand, Gilbert. And I would have, yesterday we introduced them, and there were some others that have joined us since yesterday. And I would introduce them all, but let me tell you, it's a whole lot more fun just to walk up to them and start talking to them because they are lovely people and they really have enjoyed their worship time with us. There is a lovely bowl on the table there that you can put your contributions in or information you can take with you if you want to pray about it and consider a substantial gift. We are going to take a 10-minute break. And during that time, I need to remind you about the silent auction if you want to take a look at that. And the book room is also open. So we will be back at 10, let's say 10:10. It's 8 minutes instead of 10, but 10:10 we'll start again. Thank you.